I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
So this episode is an elaboration on the murder of 30-year-old George Nixon Martin in 1970 that I briefly mentioned in a previous Scotland Then episode. And it was asked by one of our listeners, Shona Smileyface at CH1K13 on YouTube Music, if there was more information on this case. And yes, there absolutely is. So I'm really glad you asked about this, as while it was a case that was quickly solved, it definitely has a lot of layers to it, including the suggestion that the apparently motiveless slaying of George Nixon Martin could have been a sacrifice to the Master Satan. So, let's get started. Saturday, the 14th of February 1970, Valentine's Day, started like every other Saturday for 30-year-old George Martin. He and his 29-year-old wife, Rose, woke early in the morning to get their 4 children, 9-year-old Derek, 8-year-old George, 6-year-old Ian, and 3-year-old Rosalind, washed, dressed, fed and played with, before George had to leave Rose with the children for the day while he carried out his shift as a taxi driver for Star Cabs. On that particular Saturday morning, George had to leave earlier than planned, about 10 a.m, as his taxi was off the road having been in a road crash, and so he was borrowing a friend's taxi for his shift and left early to go and collect it. George kissed his children and wife Rose goodbye, suggesting to Rose that as it was Valentine's Day, perhaps they could do something special when he got back that evening, before he then left the family home on Earn Crescent in the Menzies Hill area of Dundee, for what would be the last time. As George was leaving home to start his taxi shift, about a 17-minute drive east of Menzies Hill, 18-year-old Robert Grunwell of Kingsway East and 19-year-old Frederick Addison of Ballochmyle Drive also had plans for that Valentine's Day Saturday, but they weren't romantic plans. They were murderous. Robert Grunwell and Frederick Addison had booked a taxi to pick them up from Robert's family's flat on Kingsway East for about 1:45 p.m. that Saturday afternoon. But David Stephen, the taxi driver that had been booked to pick the 2 youths up, had been held up with another fare and he was running slightly late. But he was hoping that his potential passengers would be patient and wait for him to arrive. He was only running about 5 minutes late after all. Shortly before 1:45 p.m, Frederick Addison arrived outside Robert's flat, having made the 13-minute walk from his own home, and Robert and Frederick waited on the pavement for the imminent taxi to arrive, chatting and laughing excitedly at what they had planned for that very afternoon. However, as the minutes ticked by, their booked taxi didn't show up, and so about 1:50 p.m, when the pair saw a different taxi driving towards them, they made the decision to flag it down, thinking that their booked taxi driver, David Stephen, just wasn't going to show up. George Martin had just dropped off a fare and was driving along Kingsway East when he saw 2 youths waving him down, and so he indicated and pulled over. Noticing that the youths had some sort of long box, a holdall and a Labrador dog with them, he got out, spoke to the youths, and opened the boot of his borrowed maroon Austin A60 taxi for the youths to be able to put their luggage in. 2 of Robert Grunwell's neighbours just happened to be looking out of their windows at 1:50 p.m. on Saturday the 14th of February, and they saw a taxi pull up outside the block of flats. They saw the taxi driver get out, speak to their neighbour Robert and his friend Frederick, before Robert Grunwell, helped by the taxi driver, put the longish box into the boot of the taxi and the holdall into the back seat, before Robert Grunwell, Frederick Addison, Robert's Labrador dog Sebastian and the taxi driver all got into the taxi. with it being noted by both neighbours that both Robert Grunwell and Frederick Addison were laughing and seemed really cheerful before the taxi driver then indicated and the taxi pulled away from the curb. Once in the taxi, Robert and Frederick excitedly asked George if he could take them to the Kirkton Wood area, which was located along and just off the Tayport to St Michael's Road in Fife, no more than about a 15-minute drive south of where Robert and Frederick were picked up, telling George that they planned on going on a poaching expedition there. George told Robert and Frederick that he would be happy to take them there, but first he just had to check how much this fare would be, and so George radioed the Star Cab's base in Dundee to ask. This would be the last time anyone would hear from George. Having determined the cost of the fare to Kirkton Wood, which Robert and Frederick were happy with, George then sat back for the short journey and chatted amiably to his passengers, asking them more about their poaching expedition. At the same time George was making his way to Kirkton Wood with his two passengers, John Fernie and his wife Isabel were just getting out of their car to go for a walk along the track beside Kirkton Wood, having driven the short distance from their home in Guard Bridge. A short while later, as the couple walked along the single track, they had to make way for a maroon-coloured car with 3 people inside to pass them, with the car driving further along the track and out of sight. Mr. and Mrs. Fernie thought that this most likely would be poachers, and so didn't give it much more thought, but felt that their thoughts had been confirmed when only a few minutes later they heard the sound of a shot ring out, followed by silence. However, Mr. and Mrs. Fernie's suspicions were roused when about 15 minutes later the same maroon car came back along the track, driving at speed, but this time there were only 2 men in the car. While Mr. and Mrs. Fernie weren't able to get a good look at either of the men in the car, Mr. Fernie did make a mental note of the car's registration number, and when the car was out of sight, the couple walked in the direction of where the car had come from, and sadly found a man's body in the trees beside the road, having been shot and stabbed. Mr. and Mrs. Fernie immediately alerted the police, giving them all the information they could, and an intensive murder hunt and police search over a wide area of East Scotland, which involved more than 100 officers and a police helicopter, began. Although it would soon be discovered that police were focusing their search for George's car and his killers in the wrong area. About 5 p.m. on Saturday the 14th of February, near a farm in the town of Brechin, 30 miles or about a 41-minute drive northeast of Kirkton Wood, 18-year-old Charles, accompanied by his father, also called Charles, were driving down the road from their farm when they saw a maroon Austin A690 car stopped on the road, with 2 men and their Labrador dog standing next to it with the bonnet up. As Charles and his father got out of the car and approached the 2 men, one of the men said that the car wouldn't start and that it needed oil, but the 2 farm workers told them that they didn't have any to spare. The 4 men then decided to try and push the car to see if that would start it, but to no avail, and so Charles Sr. told the 2 men that they would be able to catch a bus to Dundee from the bottom of the road about 5:30 p.m. The men from the maroon car thanked the 2 farm workers, gave them a packet of cigarettes, shouted on their dog Sebastian, and then began walking towards the road to catch the bus, and the 2 farm workers carried on their journey. However, about 9:40 p.m. that same evening, Charles Sr. found himself walking along the same road past the maroon-coloured car, and he found a dog collar lying on the ground, which bore the name Grunwell, Kingsway East, Dundee. Not thinking anything of it, being completely unaware that 41 minutes south a massive hunt was on for 2 killers and a maroon-coloured car, Charles Sr. whistled to himself and carried on walking home. It wouldn't be until the following morning, when the farm workers noticed that the maroon-coloured car was still in the same place, that they decided to inform the police, which, according to an article in the Daily Record, led to a dramatic helicopter flight. Following police receiving the phone call about 10 a.m. on Sunday from Charles Sr. about the missing maroon Austin A60 car having been abandoned near their farm, the RAF helicopter that had been flying over and searching the 4,000 acres of Tentsmuir Forest, not far from Kirkton Wood, swooped down into a nearby field to pick up the waiting lead detective, Superintendent Grieve, and other senior officers, before whisking them over the River Tay and to the location of the abandoned missing car near Brechin. Throughout Sunday, top CID officers, forensic officers, fingerprint experts, a police photographer and dog handlers arrived on the scene, and the car and surrounding area was thoroughly examined, while other detectives concentrated their murder inquiry on the Kingsway East area of Dundee, following Charles Sr. providing them with the dog collar he had found where the car had been abandoned, which provided the name and address of the Labrador dog's owner, 18-year-old Robert Grunwell. And on Sunday afternoon, Fife's Chief Constable said 2 men are now in custody charged with murder. Both men made their first appearance at Cooper Sheriff Court the following morning, with their heads covered with blankets as they entered, and Robert Grunwell's mother, accompanied by a neighbour, was heard to shout tearful words of encouragement to her son. Both men were charged with shooting, stabbing and murdering 30-year-old taxi driver George Martin, and it was at this point that the murderers were named as 18-year-old Robert Charles Grunwell and 19-year-old Frederick Charles Addison. Neither man made any plea at this point and were committed to prison for further inquiries. The murder trial began on the 19th of May at the High Court in Dundee before Judge Lord Robertson and a jury of 9 men and 6 women. At the outset of the trial, both men pleaded not guilty to the charge of having on the 14th of February in Kirkwood Lookers assaulted 30-year-old George Nixon Martin, of having discharged a loaded shotgun into his back and of stabbing him repeatedly on the body with a knife or similar instrument, and of having murdered him. The prosecution at this time stated that they planned to call 73 witnesses to the stand, but due to another dramatic turn of events, not all of these witnesses would be called. First to take to the stand were Mr. and Mrs. Fernie, who recounted having seen the maroon car with 3 men inside pass them at Curtin Wood before they heard a shot, and saw the same car drive past them at speed, with then only having 2 men inside, before they then found George Martin's body. Also taking to the stand were the 2 separate neighbours of Robert Grunwell, who had seen Robert and Frederick and Robert's Labrador dog get into a maroon-coloured car on Saturday the 14th of February and put a long box in the boot of the car. When they were shown a shotgun and asked if this could have been what was in the long box they saw, they confirmed that yes, the box they saw might just have been long enough to have contained a shotgun. Other exhibits taken from the taxi and the suspects' homes and shown to witnesses included 4 knives, a bayonet, a shotgun, an air pistol, and a garrote. Fife Police Surgeon Dr. William Preston also took to the stand and said that George had been shot in the back with a shotgun and stabbed 4 times in the body, that after he had been killed, he had then been dragged face down about 10 yards or metres off the woodland track and dumped. On day 2, various experts, including a psychiatrist, told of what had been established following a search of Robert Grunwell and Frederick Addison's bedrooms, as well as following both men having been assessed. It was stated that Robert Grunwell was an expert in black magic, and that Frederick Addison lived in a fantasy world and was a born follower, and that he had been dominated by Robert Grunwell's personality. It was also mentioned that both killers were mentally subnormal and had sworn a loyalty to the devil, with it being stated that a sacrificial dagger and a black death mask had also been found in the taxi. It was also put forward that one motive for George's murder could have been a sacrifice to the Master Satan, as apparently to become a full member of the cult, the Master demands a human sacrifice. It was also disclosed, according to the Daily Mail, that Frederick Addison had suffered severe brain damage in a road accident when he was 4 years old, and that Frederick and Robert Grunwell had attended the same special school in Dundee. A detective also took to the stand and said, according to the Daily Record on the 21st of May 1970, that Robert Grunwell had kept a diary and had written in this diary in the days before George was murdered. Robert Grunwell had written, "I call upon the forces of evil to help me in my task," with it being a possibility that this task could have been the killing of George Martin. The detective went on to read out the statements made by both Robert Grunwell and Frederick Addison at the time of their arrest, where they both blamed each other for George's murder, hence why they both were pleading not guilty. Frederick Addison said that when the 3 of them had arrived in Curtin Wood, Robert Grunwell had told the taxi driver George to get out of the car, and that Robert then shot him in the back and stabbed him repeatedly. He said that they then drove the car across the River Tay and onto Brecon, where the car broke down. Robert Grunwell, however, said in his statement that the gun had accidentally gone off and George had been shot when Frederick Addison had put the gun on the ground, going on to say that Fred panicked when he saw the man half dead and stuck his knife into him. While the experts and detectives were in the witness box relaying this information, it was said that Robert Grunwell had a smile on his face and Frederick Addison wore a sullen expression on his. Taking to the stand on day 2 of the trial were the 2 farm workers, Father Charles Sr. and his 18-year-old son, also Charles. The 2 defendants didn't bat an eye when 18-year-old Charles was on the stand, but they and their counsel appeared to grow more and more uneasy as Charles Sr. gave his statement. And just after Charles Sr. had finished up his testimony by saying that he had found a dog collar near the maroon-coloured car bearing the name Sebastian with the name and address of Robert Grunwell displayed on it, the defence teams called for an adjournment. After which, both Robert Grunwell and Frederick Addison were now pleading guilty to the reduced charge of culpable homicide. What would you think about this if you were the family of George Martin? And do you think the prosecution accepted this offer, bearing in mind all the witness statements and evidence they had? Well, following a discussion, and due to the medical evidence that showed both youths suffered from diminished responsibility, Mr. John McCluskey, on behalf of the Crown, accepted this reduced plea. All that was left to do then was for Judge Lord Robertson to sentence the pair. Addressing the youths, he said that they had admitted to a brutal and apparently motiveless crime that led to the death of an innocent man who was a complete stranger to you and who did you no wrong. He then sentenced both youths to 12 years in a youth offenders institution. It was said again that as the 2 were led away, Robert Grunwell still had a smile on his face and Frederick Addison maintained a sullen, morose expression. And the motive for George Martin's murder went with them. But one motive it wasn't was robbery, as George's takings for that day were also found fully intact in his abandoned taxi. Robert's mother and brothers refused to talk to reporters after the trial, but while it was reported that Frederick's mum and dad were in bitter shock, his father did say that he regretted not having tried harder to break up his son's friendship with Robert Grunwell. Following George's murder, Dundee taxi drivers started a fund for George's widow, Rose, and their 4 children, 9-year-old Derek, 8-year-old George, 6-year-old Ian, and 3-year-old Rosalind. After the trial, Rose spoke to a Daily Record reporter at her home, surrounded by her 4 children. She said, "Since George died, everyone has been very helpful. The fund brought £1,500, and I'm grateful. But it will never compensate for the loss of my husband." She went on to say that, "I will never forget that day. It was such a senseless way my husband had to die." One taxi driver who also will never forget the 14th of February 1970 is David Stephen, as just 5 minutes stood between him living and being the victim that day. And that was the senseless and apparently motiveless murder of 30-year-old George Nixon Martin. Thank you again, Shona Smiley Face at CH1K13 on YouTube Music, for asking me to research a bit more into this case. If you enjoyed this episode, we would so appreciate it if you would rate or review Scottish Murders. It really does help others to find our podcast, and I'd love to share more Scottish Murders. I've been your host, Dawn.